The Baltic wind cut across the isolated peninsula like a knife. Peenemünde. Even the name sounded remote, forgotten. But on October 3rd, 1942, this desolate stretch of German coastline witnessed humanity's first step toward the stars, and its first step toward a new kind of hell. Werner von Braun stood in the control bunker, his hands trembling, not from fear, but from barely contained euphoria. He was 30 years old, tall, blond, with the chiseled features of a propaganda poster and the mind of a visionary. Through the observation slit, he watched his creation Aggregate 4, soon to be renamed Vergeltungswaffe 2. Vengeance Weapon 2 pierced the autumn sky. 14 tons of steel and alcohol fuel rose on a pillar of fire. The thunder shook the concrete beneath their feet. 56 seconds later, the engine cut off. The rocket had reached 53 miles high, the edge of space itself. Von Braun turned to his colleagues, eyes gleaming with tears. "Today," he said in German, "the spaceship was born." But General Walter Dornberger, the military commander of the project, had a different vision. "Do you realize what we've done?" he asked the assembled engineers.
"We have invaded space with our rocket and for the first time used it as a bridge between 2 points on Earth. We have proven rocket propulsion practicable for space travel."
Then he paused, and his next words carried a darker weight. "This is the key to the universe, but also the key to destroying our enemies." The duality was there from the beginning. Space or war, dreams or death. Werner von Braun had been obsessed with rockets since childhood. As a boy in Weimar, Germany, he'd read Hermann Oberth's The Rocket into Planetary Space and felt his destiny crystallize. While other children played with toys, young Werner strapped 6 large firework rockets to his toy wagon. The resulting explosion sent him careening through the streets of Berlin, terrifying pedestrians and earning him a visit from the police. His mother, an amateur astronomer, encouraged his obsession. She gave him a telescope. Through it, he gazed at the moon, at Mars, and dreamed of walking on their surfaces. The universe called to him with a voice he couldn't ignore. By 1930, at 18, he was assisting Oberth in liquid-fueled rocket experiments. By 1932, the German army noticed his work. Captain Walter Dornberger offered him something no civilian organization could: unlimited funding, state-of-the-art facilities, and freedom from financial constraints. There was just one condition: the rockets would be weapons. Von Braun barely hesitated. In his mind, the calculation was simple. Civilian space programs didn't exist. If he wanted to reach the stars, he needed the military's money. He would build their weapons, yes, but he would design them with space in mind. Every weapons test was, in his view, also a test for his future spacecraft. It was a devil's bargain, and von Braun signed it with enthusiasm. By 1937, Peenemünde was built a sprawling complex of laboratories, test stands, and production facilities on the Baltic coast. Thousands of Germany's brightest engineers and scientists flocked there. It was a city of the future, dedicated to reaching it. But outside the laboratory windows, Germany was changing. The Nazi Party's grip tightened. Jewish colleagues disappeared overnight. The Nuremberg laws made daily life a hierarchy of race. Von Braun noticed, of course, but he didn't leave. The rockets were too important. Space was too close. In 1940, von Braun joined the SS. His later explanations would vary. "I was pressured. It was necessary for my work. I had no choice. Heinrich Himmler himself invited him. And in Nazi Germany, you didn't refuse the Reichsfuhrer SS." Von Braun wore the black uniform. He attended SS functions. He held the rank of Sturmbannführer Major. And all the while, he told himself and anyone who would listen, "I'm not political. I just want to build rockets." But rockets, as it turned out, were the most political thing of all. The V2 that emerged from Peenemünde was a masterpiece of engineering and a harbinger of horror. 46 feet tall, 13 tons, capable of reaching speeds over 3,500 miles per hour faster than sound, faster than any defense could track. It would arc into the stratosphere and descend on its target with the force of a meteor. Its warhead carried 1 ton of high explosive, not enough to destroy a city, but enough to obliterate a city block. And against the V-2, there was no defense. It arrived without warning. No air raid siren could detect it. The explosion came before the sound of its approach. Victims heard the supersonic boom only after the warhead had already detonated. Winston Churchill would later write, "The rocket was very unpleasant. You could do nothing about it." By 1943, Hitler was desperate. The tide of war had turned. Stalingrad had fallen. Allied bombers darkened German skies daily. Hitler saw the V-2 as salvation, a Wunderwaffe, a wonder weapon that would terrorize Britain into surrender. "I want thousands of these rockets," he screamed at von Braun during a demonstration. "Tens of thousands. I want London to burn." Von Braun nodded, presented technical specifications, discussed production schedules. Inside, part of him still dreamed of Mars. But the reality was becoming unavoidable. His spaceship was being born as a weapon of mass murder. And to build it at the scale Hitler demanded, they would need workers. Many, many workers. The concentration camps had workers. The Kohnstein Mountain in central Germany looked peaceful from the outside. Inside, it contained hell. Mittelbau Dora. The name meant nothing to most Germans during the war. After the war, it would become synonymous with one of the Holocaust's darkest chapters, the intersection of cutting-edge technology and absolute human degradation. In 1943, after British bombers devastated Peenemünde in Operation Hydra, Hitler ordered V-2 production moved underground. The SS found the solution. 2 massive tunnels, each a mile long, carved into the mountain by prisoners. Here, protected from Allied bombs, the rockets would be built. But built by whom? The answer came in cattle cars from concentration camps across occupied Europe. Buchenwald, Auschwitz, Sachsenhausen, French resistance fighters, Polish intellectuals, Russian POWs, Jews, communists, political prisoners, anyone the Reich deemed expendable. 20,000 men would pass through Mittelbau Dora. 12,000 would die there. Arthur Rudolph was von Braun's production manager. Before the war, he'd been a brilliant engineer. Now he oversaw the transformation of concentration camp prisoners into rocket-building machines. The conditions inside the tunnels defied comprehension. Prisoners worked 12-hour shifts in the dark, damp corridors. No daylight, no fresh air. The temperature hovered just above freezing. The noise from machinery never stopped a constant grinding roar that drove men mad. They slept in the tunnels themselves, 4 tiers of wooden bunks stacked against the walls. No mattresses, no blankets. Lice and typhus spread like wildfire. The latrines were open buckets that overflowed daily. The stench was so overwhelming that SS guards wore masks. Prisoners died from exhaustion, starvation, disease. They died from beatings for working too slowly. They died from random executions to maintain terror. On average, 1 prisoner died for every 10 rockets produced. One survivor, Jean-Michel, later testified, "In the tunnels, we were not treated as human beings. We were not treated as animals. We were treated as things, expendable things." And Werner von Braun? He visited Mittelbau Dora regularly. This is documented. Survivors identified him. Photographs show him touring the facility. He walked through those tunnels, past the skeletal figures in striped uniforms, inspecting his precious rockets. In one documented incident, from 1944, von Braun personally selected skilled workers from Buchenwald to work on guidance systems. He knew they were concentration camp prisoners. He knew the conditions. He chose them anyway. And they were transferred to Dora. After the war, von Braun would claim ignorance. "I didn't know how bad it was. I was focused on technical problems. I had no authority over the prisoners." But the evidence tells a different story. In a letter to Albin Sawatzky, he discussed production delays. and explicitly mentioned the need for more inmates to meet quotas. He attended planning meetings where prisoner allocation was discussed. He was not some naive scientist isolated in a laboratory. He was deeply involved in production, and production required slaves. The moral calculus had shifted. This was no longer about accepting military funding to pursue dreams of space. This was about building machines of death on the backs of dying men. And still, von Braun continued. The cruelty at Dora wasn't incidental. It was systematic. Prisoners caught sabotaging rockets, even accidentally, through exhaustion or starvation, were hanged. Not quickly. The SS used a traveling crane in Tunnel B, hoisting groups of prisoners slowly, letting them strangle to death while the others watched and continued working. The bodies were left hanging for days as warnings. One prisoner, Adam Kabbalah, survived to testify. Once I saw von Braun after a hanging. He stood there, hands in his pockets, and watched. Then he turned back to discussing technical issues with the engineers, as if nothing had happened. Von Braun would later dispute this account, but dozens of survivors remembered the tall, blonde scientist in the clean uniform walking through their nightmare, focused only on his rockets. The SS assigned Kapo's prisoner overseers to enforce discipline with clubs and whips. The German civilians who worked as foremen and engineers alongside the prisoners could see everything. Some protested. Most didn't. The rockets were too important. The Führer had ordered it. Production must continue. And production did continue. By late 1944, Dora was producing 600 volts, 2 rockets per month, each one a technological marvel, each one baptized in blood. On the 8th of September 1944, the first V2 struck London. Mary Clark was 63 years old, standing in her kitchen in Chiswick. The explosion vaporized her instantly. She became the first victim of space-age warfare, killed by a rocket that had touched the edge of space before falling to Earth. Over the next 7 months, more than 3,000 volts 2 seconds would rain down on London, Antwerp, and other Allied cities. They killed over 7,000 people. Each attack came without warning. Air raid sirens were useless. One moment, normal life. The next, a thunderclap, and buildings reduced to rubble. The psychological impact was devastating. The Germans called it Vergeltung vengeance. The British called it terror. But here's the mathematical horror that puts everything in perspective. More people died building the V2 than died from it. 12,000 slave laborers died in the tunnels. 7,000 civilians died from the rocket attacks. The weapon killed more of its makers than its targets. Think about that. The V2 program was so brutal, so inhumane in its production, that it murdered more people through slave labor than it did through actual deployment. The rockets, in a sense, were less deadly than the act of creating them. Von Braun's dream of space travel had become an instrument of mass murder twice over, once in London, twice in the Constein tunnels. As 1945 began, Germany was collapsing. Soviet armies approached from the east. American and British forces closed from the west. The Reich was being crushed between 2 juggernauts. In the Peenemünde laboratories and Dora tunnels, the rocket scientists faced a choice: surrender to the Soviets or surrender to the Americans. Von Braun gathered his top engineers. The decision was unanimous. They would surrender to the Americans. Russia meant imprisonment, probably execution. But America had resources. America had ambition. America might still need rocket scientists. Von Braun ordered crucial documents hidden: technical drawings, test data, design specifications, the blueprint for space travel, soaked in the blood of 12,000 dead. In April 1945, as Soviet troops entered the outskirts of Nordhausen near Dora, the SS began their final atrocity. They couldn't leave witnesses. Prisoners who could still walk were forced on death marches. Those too weak to move were shot or left to starve. Von Braun and his team, meanwhile, headed south toward the American lines, carrying their secrets. They were about to become the most wanted scientists in the world. On the 2nd of May, 1945, Wernher von Braun's younger brother, Magnus, approached an American private on a bicycle near the village of Schattwald in the Bavarian Alps. "My name is Magnus von Braun," he said in careful English. "My brother invented the V2. We want to surrender." It was one of the most consequential surrenders in history. The Americans couldn't believe their luck. They'd captured not just Wernher von Braun, but his entire team, over 100 of Germany's top rocket scientists, all the technical documents, and within weeks, enough V2 parts to build 100 complete rockets. But there was a problem. Many of these men were, by any reasonable definition, war criminals. The solution was Operation Paperclip, one of the most morally compromising programs in American history. The original rules were clear. No ardent Nazis, no war criminals, no one who had participated in atrocities. President Truman himself signed the directive. But the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, the military organization running the program, had different priorities. The Cold War was beginning. The Soviets were already grabbing German scientists in their occupation zone. America needed these men, needed their knowledge, before the Russians got it. So they lied. Intelligence officers systematically falsified and sanitized the scientists' records. Nazi Party memberships were erased. SS ranks disappeared. References to slave labor were deleted. Entire backgrounds were rewritten. Wernher von Braun's file was a masterpiece of deception. His SS membership? Forced, purely ceremonial. His visits to Mittelbau Dora? Unaware of the conditions. His selection of concentration camp prisoners? Never mentioned. Arthur Rudolph, the production manager who oversaw the horrors of the tunnel, had his record cleansed even more thoroughly. His file stated he was not a war criminal and posed no security threat. The paperclips that gave the operation its name were attached to the falsified dossiers, indicating the files had been processed. It was bureaucratic laundering of Nazi pasts on an industrial scale. In September 1945, von Braun and his team arrived in America as honored guests, not prisoners. They were given homes, salaries, security clearances. Within months, they were rebuilding their rockets on American soil. Fort Bliss, Texas. White Sands, New Mexico. The German scientists adapted quickly to American life. Von Braun was particularly adept. Tall, handsome, charming. He spoke English fluently within a year. He smiled for cameras. He gave lectures. He wrote articles for popular magazines about the future of space travel, the same dream he'd always had, now with a new sponsor. The Americans assembled captured V2 seconds and launched them with German crews. 67 V2 seconds were fired at White Sands between 1946 and 1952. Each launch was, ostensibly, for scientific research. But the real goal was military. Perfecting ballistic missile technology for the looming confrontation with the Soviet Union. Von Braun played the role of the repentant scientist perfectly. In interviews, he expressed regret that his rockets had been used as weapons. "I aimed for the stars," he famously said, "but sometimes I hit London." It was a clever line. Self-deprecating, witty, suggesting the targeting of civilians was an unfortunate accident. Rather than the rocket's explicit purpose, American audiences ate it up. But not everyone was fooled. Some intelligence officers who had investigated Mittelbau Dora filed protests. They had seen the tunnels. They had interviewed survivors. They knew what von Braun and his team had done. Their reports were classified and buried. Jewish organizations protested. Survivor groups protested. Former Allied POWs who had been enslaved in the German war machine protested. The government's response was always the same. These scientists were too valuable to lose. National security trumped justice. The future trumped the past. And so the men who had built weapons on the bones of slaves became American citizens, American heroes, fathers of the American space program. The Cold War demanded it. Or so they said. The irony was profound. While Nazi war criminals were being hunted across the globe, tried at Nuremberg, hanged for their crimes, The rocket scientists lived comfortable lives in the American Southwest, welcomed as assets rather than prosecuted as criminals. The distinction, apparently, was usefulness. If you had knowledge America wanted, your past could be erased. If you didn't, you faced justice. Hermann Goering hanged. Julius Streicher hanged. Wilhelm Keitel hanged. Wernher von Braun promoted. The message was clear. Morality was negotiable when strategic interests were at stake. And von Braun thrived in this environment. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that his value lay in his vision of the future, not his actions in the past. So he talked endlessly about space, moon bases, Mars colonies, the destiny of mankind among the stars. He became America's public face of rocketry, appearing on television, consulting with Walt Disney on educational films about space exploration. Children dreamed of becoming astronauts because of von Braun's infectious enthusiasm. The past was never mentioned. The tunnels were forgotten. The bodies were buried, literally and metaphorically. But history has a way of resurfacing. In 1947, a French documentary crew tried to film inside Mittelbau Dora. The footage was deemed too disturbing for public viewing and was locked away for decades. Survivor testimonies were published, but largely ignored. The Cold War demanded heroes, not moral complexity. Then, in 1969, the year of von Braun's greatest triumph, a German court finally investigated Mittelbau Dora. They found evidence of systematic murder, torture, and exploitation. They issued arrest warrants for several guards and administrators. Arthur Rudolph, von Braun's production manager, was named as a potential defendant. By then, he was a celebrated NASA engineer, recipient of the Distinguished Service Medal. The charges were quietly dropped due to insufficient evidence, though the evidence was actually overwhelming. Rudolph was simply too important to prosecute. Von Braun himself was never formally investigated. He had too many protectors, too many powerful friends, and he had delivered what America wanted most: victory in the space race. The 16th of July, 1969. Kennedy Space Center, Florida. The Saturn V rocket stood on the launch pad like a cathedral of ambition. 363 feet tall, 6.5 million pounds. The most powerful machine ever built by human hands. At its base, 5 F-1 engines, each one generating 1.5 million pounds of thrust. At its apex, 3 astronauts: Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins, and in the control room, orchestrating humanity's greatest technological achievement, was Wernher von Braun. He was 57 years old now, director of the Marshall Space Flight Center, the chief architect of America's moon rocket, the man who would fulfill the dream he'd held since childhood, putting humans on another world. As the countdown reached 0 and the Saturn V rose on a pillar of fire that lit up the Florida coast, von Braun wept. Were they tears of joy, vindication, relief? Perhaps all three. 4 days later, Armstrong's boot touched the lunar surface. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. The dream was real. Von Braun had done it. He had reached the stars. But the question that haunted him, that should haunt us, remained. At what price? The Saturn V was, in many ways, a direct descendant of the V2. The same basic principles, the same liquid fuel engines, the same genius that had designed the weapon now designed the spacecraft. Von Braun never hid this lineage. In fact, he celebrated it. The V2 had been the proof of concept. The Saturn V was its fulfillment. But here's what he rarely acknowledged. The Saturn V succeeded partly because of knowledge gained through the deaths at Mittelbau Dora, engineering insights, manufacturing techniques, lessons about fuel mixtures and structural stress, learned while prisoners died building prototypes. Can you separate the knowledge from how it was obtained? Can you use data gathered through atrocity without becoming complicit in that atrocity? This is the question that haunts medical ethics to this day, stemming partly from Nazi medical experiments. The data exists. It was gathered through unspeakable cruelty. Do we use it to save lives now, or reject it to honor the dead? There are no easy answers. Von Braun became an American icon. He appeared on the cover of Time magazine multiple times. He hobnobbed with presidents. He received the National Medal of Science from President Ford. But the past kept knocking. In 1984, Arthur Rudolph von Braun's production manager was finally investigated by the Office of Special Investigations, the U.S. government unit tasked with finding Nazi war criminals. They found overwhelming evidence of his role in the Mittelbau Dora atrocities. Faced with denaturalization and potential prosecution, Rudolph agreed to renounce his citizenship and leave the United States. He returned to Germany, never expressing remorse, maintaining until his death in 1996 that he had only done his duty. The investigation renewed attention on the other Operation Paperclip scientists. How many war criminals had America sheltered in the name of the space program and Cold War? By then, von Braun was already dead. He died in 1977 of pancreatic cancer, honored and celebrated to the end. At his funeral, colleagues and astronauts praised him as a visionary, a genius, the father of space exploration. The prisoners of Mittelbau Dora were not mentioned. So how do we judge Werner von Braun? The facts are clear. He joined the Nazi Party. He joined the SS. He witnessed slave labor and did nothing to stop it. In fact, he facilitated it. He knew prisoners were dying to build his rockets, and he continued anyway. After the war, he lied about his involvement. He minimized his knowledge. He allowed his Nazi past to be erased so he could continue his work. And yet, he also achieved something extraordinary. He pushed human civilization forward. He made spaceflight possible. The Apollo program inspired an entire generation. The scientific knowledge gained from the space race has benefited all of humanity. Does the achievement redeem the sin? Can it? Von Braun himself seemed to believe it could. In his later years, he became more philosophical, even spiritual. He saw space exploration as humanity's destiny, and himself as an instrument of that destiny. The past was regrettable, he suggested, but the future justified it. But to the survivors of Mittelbau Dora, those who lived to tell of the tunnels, this calculus was obscene. Their suffering wasn't a stepping stone to the stars. It was murder. And the fact that murder eventually led to something great doesn't make it less monstrous. Jean-Michel, one of the survivors, met von Braun in 1969, shortly after the moon landing. It was a chance encounter at a conference. Michel confronted him. "Do you remember Mittelbau Dora? Do you remember what you saw there?" Von Braun, by all accounts, went pale. "I was only a scientist," he said. "I was not responsible for those things." "You were there," Michel replied. "You saw us. We saw you. You chose to continue." Von Braun had no answer. He walked away. That interaction encapsulates the moral core of this story. Von Braun could justify his actions to the American public, to history, perhaps even to himself. But he could not justify them to the men whose suffering he had witnessed and ignored. Today, we name schools and buildings after von Braun. We celebrate him in museums. NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center features his legacy prominently. Some argue this is appropriate. We should honor the achievement, not the man's full history. Others argue it's obscene. Honoring von Braun dishonors his victims. The debate continues. What's undeniable is this. The space age was born in the tunnels of Mittelbau Dora as much as on the launch pads of Cape Canaveral. The rockets that put men on the moon were conceived by the same minds that built weapons of terror on the backs of slaves. Progress and atrocity, genius and monstrosity, dreams and death, all intertwined, inseparable. Werner von Braun reached for the stars. He got there, but his hands were never clean. And the question remains, echoing across the decades. Can a genius built on bones ever be justified? History offers no answer. It only offers the facts. and asks us to judge.